The sound that haunts me most is the click of a wine glass on marble, followed by the faint hush of whispers that stopped the moment I entered the room. Tessa sat too close to my husband, her hand resting lightly on his arm, as though it belonged there, while Mark smiled in a way I hadn't seen in years. The chandelier above them sparkled like nothing was wrong yet. In that instant, my entire world tilted. I stood, frozen, clutching the casserole dish I had brought my fingers digging into its handles, as if holding tighter could keep my life from slipping away. The voices that had been so quick and lively moments before dissolved into awkward silence, the kind that presses on your chest until it hurts. Before I tell you everything, take a moment and share in the comments where you're listening from tonight. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to hear more stories where truth, betrayal, and quiet justice finally come to light. My name is Elena, and at 46 years old, I had built what I believed was a steady, ordinary life. I worked as a high school counselor, a role that kept me close to the heart of my community, while Mark provided for us through his job in regional sales. We had a 17-year-old daughter, Lily, bright and ambitious, with her father's confidence and my stubborn streak. From the outside, our life in suburban Maryland looked comfortable, perhaps even enviable. 2 steady careers, a decent home, family dinners around the table, and occasional weekends away. I clung to that sense of normalcy because I thought it was enough. Mark had always been admired for his charm. He could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with 3 new friends and a handful of business leads. I used to love watching him work a crowd, how effortlessly he carried conversations and made people feel seen. But charm can be a double-edged thing, and I should have known that when you're not careful, the same warmth that draws people to you can also give them permission to cross boundaries. I noticed it with his friends, especially with Tessa, a woman I had trusted for years. We met when our daughters were in middle school, sharing carpool duties and weekend coffee breaks, and somewhere along the way, she had become part of our inner circle. My upbringing had been different. My parents raised me with quiet values: work hard, live within your means, and stand by your word. My father had been a public school teacher, my mother a nurse, and they had built a life without glamour, but with integrity. Marrying Mark felt like stepping into another world, one where appearances carried weight and success was measured by the size of a client dinner bill. For years I told myself the blend of our worlds was good for us, that balance made us stronger. But balance only works when both sides respect the weight they carry. At first, there were only small moments that gave me pause. A compliment from Tessa that lingered a little too long on Mark's smile, or the way she knew details about his work trips before I did. I dismissed it, telling myself I was imagining things, that friendship naturally blurred lines sometimes. Mark reassured me often enough, and I wanted to believe him. After all, we had Lily watching us, and the last thing I wanted was to teach my daughter to see suspicion where trust should live. So I smoothed over the doubts, buried them under school schedules and dinner plans, convincing myself love meant silence more than questions. Looking back, I realize I was blind to the shift in the air around me. There were dinners where I felt like an outsider in my own home, watching Mark and Tessa trade glances and jokes that seemed rehearsed. There were nights when his phone lit up with messages he dismissed as work, though the smile that crossed his face wasn't one he wore for clients. I tried to swallow my unease, but it settled in my chest, heavy and constant, like a stone I couldn't spit out. The night I saw them together, framed in the golden light of Tessa's living room, it was no longer just a stone in my chest. It was the crack of a fault line, the kind that warns of an earthquake to come. And deep inside, though, I hadn't yet admitted it to myself. I knew my life was about to fracture in ways I could never piece back together. I told myself for weeks that what I saw at Tessa's house had been innocent, a misstep of timing, and nothing more. Yet the feeling clung to me heavy as a damp coat that refused to dry. I noticed the smallest changes Mark leaving his phone face down on the kitchen counter. Tessa no longer stopping by to chat in the afternoons, Lily mentioning how her father seemed distracted even during their favorite Sunday dinners. These details stacked quietly brick by brick until they began to form a wall I could no longer see past. There were evenings when Mark would claim a late meeting only to return home smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't mine. The fragrance was floral sharp in a way I could recognize anywhere because Tessa had worn it at every gathering we'd attended together. I would breathe it in as he set down his briefcase, my questions burning behind clenched teeth. Instead of asking, I busied myself with dishes or folded laundry, convincing myself that silence would protect our fragile peace. The wedding anniversary we had planned together should have been a night of celebration. I booked a table at a restaurant we both loved, one of those quiet places with soft lighting and heavy linen napkins. Mark called an hour before we were supposed to leave, apologizing, saying a client dinner had run long and he couldn't make it. His voice was smooth, practiced the kind of tone that left no room for argument. I went alone that night, pushing food around my plate, while couples around me laughed and toasted, wondering how my marriage had become a performance where I was the only one in the audience. Even Walter, my father-in-law, began to notice the shift. He stopped by one Saturday with a box of tools, claiming he wanted to fix the squeaky hinge on our back door. As he worked, he studied me with quiet eyes, finally asking if everything was all right between Mark and me. I smiled too quickly, assuring him things were fine, though my hands trembled as I poured his coffee. He didn't press further, but his silence spoke louder than any warning. Tessa, meanwhile, had grown distant in a way that felt carefully orchestrated. She no longer invited me to her luncheons or asked me to help plan fundraisers. Yet Lily would mention seeing her car parked near her father's office building, a detail she found unremarkable, but one that sent my stomach sinking. Each time I wanted to believe there was an explanation. But deep down, I knew I was clinging to threads that were already unraveling. I began keeping mental notes of the times Mark was late, the excuses he gave, the tone of his laughter when he spoke quietly on the phone in the den. I never wrote them down, but they lived in my mind like tally marks on a hidden wall. When I confronted him gently one evening, asking if something was weighing on him, he brushed me off with a kiss on the forehead and a tired smile. "Work's just demanding right now," he said. The answer sounded rehearsed, polished like the lines he used with clients. The hardest moments were those with Lily. She adored her father, leaning on him for advice about college applications and big decisions. Watching her beam as he praised her essays, I kept my doubts locked tight behind my smile. I didn't want to shatter her trust or tarnish the image she carried of us as a family. But inside, I felt myself breaking piece by piece, torn between protecting her and facing the truth I feared. Late at night, when the house was quiet, I lay awake, replaying conversations in my head. I thought about the small ways Mark had once shown his love, picking up my favorite tea without being asked, holding my hand at the movies, leaving notes on the counter before long trips. Those gestures had disappeared slowly, almost imperceptibly, until one day they were simply gone. What remained was a polite distance, a careful civility that left me lonelier than I had ever been before. One evening, I passed by our living room and caught sight of Mark on the couch with his laptop. The screen glowed on his face, his expression softened in a way I hadn't seen directed toward me in years. His fingers flew across the keys, a small smile tugging at his lips. When he realized I was standing there, he closed the computer too quickly, muttering something about work emails. The look in his eyes told me it was not business he had been writing. The silence between us became heavier with each passing day. We shared meals, but not conversations, routines, but not intimacy. I could feel my marriage slipping into shadows, and though I wanted to cling to hope, the evidence surrounded me. The perfume, the whispers, the half-truths, they all pointed toward a reality I wasn't ready to name. Still, I told myself I needed proof. I couldn't risk dismantling our life, not without certainty. So I waited, watching quietly, gathering the fragments of a truth that was already breaking my heart. And somewhere in that waiting, I began to understand that denial would no longer shield me. The cracks had deepened, and soon they would be impossible to ignore. The hardest part of carrying suspicion is how it seeps into the smallest moments, dulling the color of everything you once took for granted. I tried to keep life steady for Lily, smiling at her stories about school, reminding her to focus on applications. But inside, I was unraveling. Nights stretched long as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling and wondering how many truths were being hidden from me. The house no longer felt like a safe place. It felt like a stage where I played the part of a wife who didn't know she was being replaced. When Mark sat across from me at dinner, I studied the way he avoided my eyes, how he cut his food with deliberate care but spoke little. Even silence can be cruel when it's heavy with meaning. I wanted to reach for him to ask directly if there was someone else, but fear tightened my throat. If he admitted it, our life as we knew it would be gone. So instead, I swallowed my questions and carried the ache quietly. It wasn't only the distance between us. It was the way Tessa seemed to orbit closer to our lives, even as she kept me at arm's length. I would catch her name flashing on his phone, or see photos on social media that placed them in the same rooms at industry events I hadn't been told about. Friends mentioned casually that they had seen Mark with her at lunches, assuming I was aware, their words landing like stones I had to carry alone. Each remark left me smiling on the outside, while inside, I crumbled further. Walter stopped by again one afternoon, saying he had extra vegetables from his garden. He handed me a basket of tomatoes and peppers, his eyes searching my face as though he already knew what I refused to say aloud. As we stood on the porch, he placed a weathered hand on mine and said quietly, "Elena, don't let yourself be the last one to know." His words pierced through me, not harsh, but heavy with experience. I managed a nod, though my chest burned with the effort to hold back tears. I began to dread evenings when Mark returned home with exhaustion written across his face, but no affection in his gestures. There were no casual hugs from behind, as I cooked, no laughter echoing through the rooms. Even Lily noticed. One night, she asked if Dad was mad about something because he seemed different. I assured her that work had been stressful, but the guilt of lying to my own daughter left me hollow. I wanted to protect her from what I feared, but hiding the truth from her weighed on me as much as his betrayal did. The isolation became sharper at family gatherings. At a barbecue with neighbors, I stood off to the side as Mark and Tessa carried on a conversation that looked too familiar, too easy. Their heads bent close, smiles shared like private jokes, and I could feel eyes around us noticing. I excused myself to the restroom, locking the door behind me, just to have a few minutes to breathe. My reflection in the mirror looked older, wearier than I remembered, and for the first time, I whispered to myself, "He's slipping away." I tried to confide in a close colleague at school, thinking that speaking the words aloud might lighten the burden. She listened quietly as I described the perfume, the missed dinners, the distance. When I finished, she simply said, "You don't deserve to live in silence." Her kindness was steadying, yet I still returned home that night, unable to confront him. Fear of breaking what little we had left was stronger than my need for truth. The loneliness pressed in, hardest at night. I would reach across the bed and feel the empty space where he once slept close. He stayed later at the office now, sometimes slipping into bed after I had drifted into a shallow sleep. Even then, I sensed the difference in the way his body turned away from mine, no longer reaching for the comfort we used to share. The absence of touch hurt more than words ever could. In the quiet of those nights, tears would slide into my pillow as I thought about the years I had given to our marriage. I remembered the promises we made when Lily was born, the times we weathered challenges together, the laughter we once shared. Now those memories felt like they belonged to someone else's life, not mine. I grieved in silence, careful not to wake him, careful not to let Lily see the red in my eyes in the morning. It became clear that pretending could not go on forever. I was breaking under the weight of what I knew but would not admit. The small cracks had widened, and soon I would have no choice but to face them. I didn't yet know how or when, but deep inside, I felt the shift. Silence would not protect me much longer. Something was coming, and I would have to decide whether to close my eyes again or finally let the truth in. The night it all shifted began like any other, with me waiting at the kitchen table for Mark to come home. The clock ticked past 9, then 10, and my dinner plate sat untouched, while the candles I had lit burned low. I told myself he was busy, that traffic was heavy, but the truth pressed in too loudly to ignore. When headlights finally swept across the window, I straightened in my chair, rehearsing calm words I wasn't sure I had the strength to say. Mark walked through the door, carrying the faint smell of cologne that wasn't his. His tie was loose, his jacket draped carelessly over one arm, and his eyes flicked toward me with a quickness that felt guilty. "Long night," he muttered, avoiding the table, as if the sight of a meal waiting for him was an accusation. I sat still, my hands folded tightly, and asked where he had been. His answer was clipped, nothing more than with clients, but the hollowness in his tone told me everything I needed to know. The words I had been afraid to speak slipped out before I could stop them. Was it Tessa? The question hung in the air, sharp and unrelenting. His face hardened, and though he didn't confirm it, the silence that followed was louder than any denial could have been. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing with the realization that the pieces I had been trying to hold together were already broken. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing beside me, wondering how long he had chosen her over me, wondering how much of our life together had already been a performance. My body felt like stone, too heavy to move, yet my mind raced through every detail: the perfume, the laughter, the quick glances at gatherings. The truth was no longer something I could push aside. It was here, and it had settled into my bones. The days that followed blurred into one another. I moved through routines at work, listening to students talk about their futures, while inside, I grieved the future I thought I had. Lily noticed more than I wanted her to. She asked why her father seemed distracted, why I looked tired in the mornings. I told her school was busy, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. I wanted to shield her from the truth, but the cracks in our home were becoming too deep to hide. Walter visited again one afternoon, bringing a bag of apples from the farmer's market. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, his gaze steady, his voice gentle when he asked, "Is he hurting you, Elena?" I shook my head quickly, though my throat closed around the words I couldn't say. He reached across the table, covering my hand with his, and whispered, "You don't deserve to carry this alone." Tears welled in my eyes, but I turned away before they could fall. One evening, after another dinner eaten in silence, I excused myself and walked through the neighborhood. The autumn air was cool, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke. Each step steadied me, each breath clearer than the last, until I finally admitted what I had been refusing to face. Mark had made his choice, whether he had spoken it aloud or not. And if I continued to stay silent, I would be the one left without dignity. That realization frightened me, but it also gave me strength. I began paying closer attention, noticing details I had once ignored: the hushed phone calls, the late-night text messages, the way he grew defensive when I asked simple questions. Each piece was a confirmation, and though it hurt, it also began to harden something inside me. My silence was no longer born of denial. It was a waiting silence, steady and deliberate, as I gathered the truth I would one day lay bare. At school, I found myself counseling a student who was struggling with betrayal by a close friend. As she spoke, her voice breaking, I realized I was hearing my own pain reflected back. I told her that sometimes the hardest part of betrayal is not the act itself, but the moment we finally acknowledge it. My words were meant for her, but as they left my lips, I felt them settle in me like a quiet vow. I returned home that evening with a new resolve. I didn't confront Mark, not yet. Instead, I watched more closely, listening and learning, letting the weight of the truth anchor me instead of drown me. My grief was still raw, but beneath it, something sharper began to form. It was not rage, not yet, but a clarity I had long been missing. The night ended quietly, with Mark asleep beside me and Lily tucked safely in her room. I lay in the dark, my eyes open to the ceiling, knowing there was no turning back. I had crossed a threshold, and the woman who once begged for peace in silence no longer lived here. Something within me had awakened, and I could feel its steady rise, promising that the days of pretending were coming to an end. Once the truth had finally settled in me, my grief shifted into something steadier, quieter, but no less powerful. I no longer cried into my pillow at night. Instead, I lay awake and thought carefully about what I could do. It wasn't enough to know Mark was unfaithful. I needed to reclaim the ground I had lost, even if my steps forward were so small they seemed invisible to him. I began by creating distance subtle enough that he wouldn't call it out. When he came home late, I didn't wait at the table anymore. I packed leftovers neatly and went to bed early with a book. On weekends, I filled my hours with errands, coffee with friends, or long walks. The house no longer revolved around him, and though he didn't say anything directly, I caught the flicker of unease in his expression when he noticed I wasn't waiting at the door or asking about his day. At school, I poured myself into work with a focus that surprised even me. I volunteered for extra committees and stayed late to help students who needed guidance. Every hour I invested in someone else's future became a quiet rebellion against the hours Mark had stolen from mine. My colleagues saw me as committed, even thriving. But inside, I knew this was more than dedication. It was a way of proving to myself that my worth wasn't tied to the man who had betrayed me. I also began keeping a careful record, something I had avoided before. Receipts tucked into a folder phone, bills copied, and saved details written down in a plain notebook I kept hidden in my desk drawer at school. I wasn't sure when or how I would use them, but writing the facts steadied me. Each page of evidence replaced some of the uncertainty I had lived with for too long. Lily noticed the changes, though she didn't understand them. One evening, she asked if I wanted to watch a movie with her and Mark the way we used to. I smiled and told her I had papers to grade. She accepted my answer, but I could see the confusion in her eyes. It broke my heart to pull back from moments with her, yet I knew she would be better served by a mother who was clear-eyed and steady than one who clung to false peace. Walter, too, sensed the shift. He stopped by one morning with a box of old tools, saying he was clearing his shed. As we carried it into the garage together, he glanced at me and asked, "You holding up?" His tone was gentle without judgment. I nodded and for the first time in weeks, I let myself admit softly, "I'm figuring things out." He didn't press further, just patted my shoulder as though to say he trusted I would. Mark, on the other hand, began to notice the silence between us. He would ask where I had been if I returned late from work, his questions sharper than before. When I answered calmly, offering no explanations beyond the truth, he seemed unsettled. He was used to my attention, my worry, my efforts to smooth over every rough edge. Now, without those, the cracks between us grew wider. One Saturday, I stood at the kitchen counter slicing vegetables when he walked in. He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, and asked why I hadn't joined him at a company dinner the night before. I wiped my hands on a towel and said evenly, I wasn't invited. He opened his mouth to argue, but stopped short when he realized I was right. The silence that followed carried more weight than any shouting match could have. In the evenings after Lily was asleep, I began to write letters to myself. They weren't meant for anyone else's eyes, just quiet affirmations that I had the right to my own dignity, the right to move forward without fear. Some nights, the words came haltingly, but over time, they grew steadier, firmer. Those pages became a map, guiding me from grief to resolve. I also started paying closer attention to Tessa's movements. Without confronting her directly, I listened carefully when her name surfaced in conversations, when neighbors mentioned seeing her car outside certain restaurants, or when mutual acquaintances mentioned her in passing. I gathered these details like pieces of a puzzle, not rushing to fit them together, but laying them out so the picture could form in its own time. What surprised me most was how calm I felt as these steps unfolded. I wasn't plotting grand revenge or shouting accusations. I was reclaiming myself inch by inch in ways Mark couldn't control or even fully see. Each quiet act, a file tucked away an evening spent alone, a meeting at school, became a declaration that I would no longer live in the shadows of his choices. The loneliness didn't vanish, but it no longer ruled me. I could sit in our living room with the lamp casting a warm glow on the pages of a book and feel at peace even with him in the next room pretending nothing had changed. That peace came not from denial, but from the knowledge that I was no longer powerless. Still, I knew the time for silence would not last forever. These small steps were leading me somewhere, building toward a truth that could not remain hidden. The question wasn't if I would face it, but when. And in the stillness of those evenings, I began to sense that the moment of breaking open was closer than I had imagined. The night it all came crashing down began with an invitation I couldn't ignore. Mark announced at dinner that his company was hosting a client reception at a downtown hotel, insisting I attend with him. Lily smiled, encouraging me to go, and I agreed, though the unease in my chest grew heavier with each passing day. Something told me this evening would reveal what had been simmering beneath the surface for too long. The ballroom gleamed with polished marble floors and the low hum of conversation. Men in suits clutched glasses of bourbon. Women in elegant dresses clustered in small groups, and the air smelled faintly of lilies from the centerpieces on each table. Mark guided me through the crowd with a practiced smile, his hand on the small of my back, though the touch felt rehearsed. I kept my posture steady, my chin lifted, determined not to let the weight of suspicion show on my face. Then, I saw her. Tessa stood across the room in a gown that shimmered under the chandeliers, her laughter ringing clear as she leaned into a group of colleagues. When her eyes found mine, she faltered, just enough to betray discomfort, before smoothing her expression into a polished smile. I returned the look with calm composure, though inside my heart clenched. Seeing them together in this setting left no room for excuses or denials. The evening dragged on, each conversation a blur, until I finally slipped out onto the balcony for air. The night was cool, city lights stretching endlessly below. I thought I had a moment to breathe when I heard familiar voices behind me. Mark and Tessa stepped outside, unaware I was there, their whispers sharp against the night air. "You can't keep stringing her along," Tessa said, her voice low but firm. "She's starting to pull away, and people are beginning to notice." Mark sighed, his hand brushing against hers. "I just need more time," he muttered. "The timing has to be right." My chest tightened as I pressed back against the stone railing, forcing myself to remain still. The truth was no longer shadows and suspicions, it was spoken plainly between them. I stepped forward, then my heels clicking against the stone, and they both froze. Tessa's hand slipped from his, her face paling as she realized I had heard every word. Mark opened his mouth, fumbling for an explanation, but I raised my hand to stop him. My voice was quiet, steady, but it carried. "I don't need excuses. I needed the truth. And now I have it." Neither of them spoke as I turned and walked back through the ballroom. I felt eyes following me, whispers beginning, though I didn't look back. The drive home was silent, Mark gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles, while I stared out the window, the city lights blurring into streaks of gold. When we reached the house, I went straight to our bedroom, gathering a small overnight bag without a word. He followed me, his voice breaking as he tried to explain. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I didn't mean to hurt you." I stopped, turning to face him with tears threatening but never falling. "You didn't mean to hurt me, Mark, but you chose her. Every day you kept silent, you chose her." His mouth opened, then closed again, as if the weight of my words had left him without defense. I spent that night at a friend's house, lying awake in her guest room, while the reality of my marriage's collapse pressed in from all sides. For years, I had carried the burden of silence, but now the truth was out, and there was no turning back. It was painful, raw, and final. Yet beneath the ache, I felt a quiet resolve forming. The time for doubt and denial was over. The following morning, I returned briefly to gather more belongings. Lily was at school, and the house felt unnaturally still. Mark sat at the kitchen table, his eyes red from a sleepless night. "Please," he whispered, "don't end it like this." I stood in the doorway, my bag in hand, and replied evenly, "You ended it long before I walked away." As I left the house, the crisp air filled my lungs, carrying with it both grief and clarity. The breaking point had come, and though it left scars, it also gave me back something I thought I had lost: my own voice. For the first time in months, I wasn't pretending. The truth had been spoken, and it was theirs to carry now, not mine. I didn't know exactly what steps would follow, but as I closed the door behind me, I knew one thing with certainty. This was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of theirs unraveling. The weeks after that night at the hotel felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the ground to give way. Mark called, texted, and even showed up outside the school where I worked, his pleas mixing apology with desperation. At first, he begged for forgiveness. Then, he shifted to blame, accusing me of destroying the family by walking away. Each message I ignored only seemed to inflame him further, as if my silence was more unbearable than anger would have been. Meanwhile, whispers began to travel through the community. Some came from neighbors, others from colleagues who had attended the reception and seen me walk out alone. Stories have a way of growing in the telling, and soon I heard that Tessa was boasting she and Mark were finally free to be together. She painted herself as the victim of a cold, absent wife, casting herself as the one who had rescued him from an empty marriage. Those lies reached me through careful friends who thought I should know their voices laced with pity. But instead of wounding me, they sharpened my resolve. I had kept a record of everything: receipts, dates, messages, even the overheard words on the balcony. I contacted an attorney, a calm woman named Diane Mercer, who specialized in family cases. Sitting across from her in her office, I laid out my folder of documents, each piece carefully preserved. She listened without judgment, her eyes steady, and when I finished, she said softly, "You've been carrying this alone long enough. Let's make sure the truth is seen clearly." Her assurance gave me strength I hadn't realized I was craving. Filing for separation was not an easy step, but it was necessary. Mark's response arrived quickly, filled with anger. He accused me of betrayal, of poisoning Lily against him, though I had shielded her from as much as I could. His words were sharp, but they only revealed his desperation. Diane reminded me that anger often comes when power slips away, and I held on to that as the process moved forward. Tessa's mask began to crack once financial matters entered the picture. Mark had promised her a future of stability, but the truth of our shared accounts and household expenses told a different story. She hadn't expected the debts from his investments or the reduced commission after a downturn at his company. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she had grown restless, her affection cooling as quickly as it had flared. The irony was bitter, but not surprising. Walter remained a quiet but steady presence. He stopped by often, fixing small things around the house or dropping off groceries, never prying, but always watching with kind eyes. One evening, he said simply, "You've done right by standing up for yourself. Don't let him drag you back down." His voice carried the weight of his own regrets, and I felt his words settle deeply in me. Lily struggled as the reality became clearer. She asked questions I wished I could shield her from, her voice trembling as she asked if her father would still come to her graduation. I held her close, assuring her that his choices didn't change her worth, that she was loved completely. Some nights she cried in her room, and I sat quietly outside her door, giving her space, but ready to step in when she needed me. Those moments were the hardest, knowing my pain had spilled into hers. Yet they also fueled my determination to protect her from further harm. The legal proceedings stretched on, but slowly the balance shifted. Mark's outbursts made him look reckless in front of mediators, while my careful records spoke calmly on my behalf. Tessa appeared once during a meeting, seated stiffly at his side, her eyes darting away from mine whenever they met. Her presence seemed more for show than conviction, and by the end of that session, I could already see the cracks widening between them. One evening, long after Lily had gone to bed, Mark came to the house unannounced. His knock was firm, insistent, and when I opened the door, he looked worn, his tie loose, his face lined with exhaustion. "You can't do this to me," he said, his voice hoarse. "You're ruining everything. Tessa's already pulling away, and without you, I have nothing." The desperation in his words cut through the night, but I stood steady. "You ruined it yourself, Mark," I replied softly. I just stopped covering the cracks. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time he looked smaller than I remembered, as if the weight of his choices had finally settled on him. After he left, I sat in the quiet living room, the lamp casting soft light across the walls. The house felt different now, not empty, but mine again. I knew there were still battles ahead, hearings, and decisions to be made, but in that moment, I felt the tide had turned. His world was unraveling piece by piece, not because I had destroyed it, but because he had built it on deception. The days that followed were calmer for me, though stormier for him. Friends mentioned that he seemed withdrawn at work, his sails slipping, his charm dimming under the weight of stress. Tessa was seen less and less at his side until eventually her absence spoke louder than any announcement could have. The man who had once stood so confident now struggled to hold on to even the fragments of what he thought he had gained. I moved through those weeks with quiet strength, focusing on Lily, on my work, and on the steady rhythm of life I was building without him. Each small victory, an evening of laughter with my daughter, a student thanking me for guidance, a simple meal enjoyed in peace felt like a step toward wholeness. The collapse of his world was no longer my burden to carry. It was his reckoning, and I had finally stepped free of its weight. Still, I knew there was one more step, a final reckoning that would close this chapter for good. As I watched the last leaves fall from the trees outside our window, I felt the season shifting, and with it, the certainty that the end was near. The first morning after the final hearing, I woke to a silence that felt different, lighter somehow. The papers were signed, the accounts divided, and the house was officially mine. No more frantic calls from Mark. No more rumors drifting back through mutual acquaintances. No more waiting for the next blow to fall. For the first time in months, I could breathe without feeling like I was stealing air from someone else's storm. Justice hadn't come in a thunderclap. It had arrived quietly through steady choices and patience. Diane, my attorney, had told me I had handled myself with dignity, and though those words were meant to reassure, they became an anchor. It mattered to me that I had not screamed or lashed out, even when it would have been easy. I had let the truth carry its own weight, and in the end, it was heavy enough. Mark drifted farther from view after the separation was finalized. I heard that Tessa had slipped away long before, once the promises of stability crumbled. He was left standing in the ruins of choices he could no longer defend. Walter visited once more, sitting across from me in the kitchen, as he had so many times before, and simply said, "I'm proud of you." His eyes carried both sorrow and respect. And in that moment, I knew he understood that his son's mistakes were his own to bear. Lily, though bruised by the upheaval, found her way back to steadiness. She threw herself into her last year of high school, filling evenings with rehearsals, study groups, and college applications. Watching her find joy again reminded me why I had chosen the harder path. She saw that I had not crumbled, and that lesson was worth more than any courtroom victory. She learned, as I did, that love should never require silence or self-erasure. The house grew quieter, yet it was not empty. I filled it with small comforts, fresh flowers on the table, music drifting through the rooms, dinners where Lily and I laughed until our sides ached. Slowly, I found myself again in the simple rituals I had once overlooked. The weight of betrayal loosened its grip, and in its place grew a quiet kind of freedom. Looking back, I realized revenge had never been my true aim. It wasn't about destroying Mark or exposing Tessa. It was about reclaiming myself from the shadows they had cast over me. The collapse of their world was theirs to face. Mine was to step forward carrying dignity even when pain had tried to strip it away. What I carry with me now is not bitterness, but clarity. Betrayal cuts deeply, but it also peels away illusions, leaving behind a sharper truth. We cannot control the choices others make, but we can decide how we respond, whether we let their actions define us or free us. I don't celebrate what happened. There is no triumph in seeing a family break, no joy in watching someone you once loved unravel. What there is, what I hold close, is the knowledge that I stood my ground. I refused to be erased, and in doing so, I showed Lily and myself what resilience truly looks like. Before we close, I'd love to know what part of this journey spoke most to you. Share your reflections in the comments, and if you'd like to hear more true family stories, stay connected here.